Hey everybody, my name is Andrew Rivera. I'm currently a second year resident here at the Studio of Missoula. I'm going to be showing you how to make the work that I do. So my work is inspired by just the sum of my parts. So I look at influential Mexican printmakers, pre-Columbian ceramics, art, food, culture, all of that good stuff. All these things inspire the surfaces that I make. So we're going to be showing you start to finish how to make these surfaces. Let's get into it. Thanks for watching.
Surface starts on the wheel, and here I am throwing one of my cups. And I wanted to use this clip to show you guys that you really need to set yourself up for whatever you may be doing. So carving, drawing, painting. And so I'm just starting by giving myself a nice straight and even wall, so pulling up very slowly. I also use this wooden rib here, and I use that because it has a nice long straight edge that's about the size of my cup or a little bit taller. I press with my finger on the inside of the pot up against that rib at about a 45-degree angle. And this just really helps make that structure in a nice straight wall. In a second here, I'm going to swap over to a steel rib, as you can see right here. And this rib, it really helps to start smooth things out. So it's going to keep that structure just like the wooden rib did, but it's going to help start smoothing everything out, taking those throwing lines off the pot. And same process, I am just pushing my finger up against the rib at a 45-degree angle. And this is just helping get rid of those throwing lines as well as structure the pot here. Right now I'm just taking it and kind of shaping that lip as well. So I just use it to form the pot after it's been thrown to give them some nice angles that you can't get just by using your fingers. Just using a small sponge here as well to kind of refine all of those little details. And all of this matters in the surface, because if you don't have the right surface to address, then it's going to make it a lot harder. Right here I'm using a rounded metal rib. This just has a smoother surface. This is my finishing rib, so it's going to take everything to the finishing point and make it ready for painting and carving. You can kind of think of each rib as a different level of sandpaper going up in grit each time to finish your surface and make it smoother for the painting and carving later on. So let's talk about underglaze and how I apply it to my pots. I really like to generally apply underglaze on a banding wheel if at all possible. It just really helps speed up the process, and that way I don't have to kind of move my arm around to paint the pot. I can just spin it on the banding wheel. So if you have one, or if your studio has one, it's super helpful if your pot is nice and round like this. I like using this brush I have here. It's a really nice brush. It has soft bristles. It soaks up a lot of the underglaze, so I don't have to re-dip it too many times if not necessary. And the way I'm starting here, I like to just do like one wet coat and then just go right on top of it with the second coat. I don't let them dry in between coats. One important detail as well is that I'm bringing the underglaze up and over the rim, and I think this just helps kind of the visual aspect of the pot. It helps bring your eye in towards the actual volume of the cup rather than stopping right at the top there and kind of having this big distinct difference between the outside and inside. Emphasizing the red clay is important, but I do want to make the white and the red unified here. So as you can see, I'm using that banding wheel to kind of speed up everything as well as to smooth everything out. So I'm just kind of checking for details, making sure there's no big drips, and I'm really just I'm trying to maintain that nice brushstroke mark, but at the same time make it smooth and even. And those brushstrokes really just help create more depth in my imagery as well. So not only do you have this white image, but it's also has another layer behind it that's the brush strokes. And here is just that brush again that I was talking about. Really nice brush, super cheap Chinese brush that I stole from my wife a couple years ago. Here I am once that first layer of underglaze has dried. And I think it's really important to think about the feet of your pots as well. They're really important to me, and they have a cultural context as well with the reference to pre-Columbian ceramics. So I like to highlight them. So here I am just kind of painting in those little crevices that I've created, and just making sure that when somebody picks that pot up, they're most likely going to flip it over, and I want that to be a little bit of a surprise too. So I'm creating this nice kind of even circle on the bottom rather than leaving those rough paint strokes, just to kind of clean everything up and highlight that chop mark in the middle as well. And then just making sure that I get any drips that kind of came off the side there, just to clean everything up, make sure it's nice and smooth but still has texture. And there's the detail on the bottom of that foot for you, and we'll see it in the carving section. To start off the carving process, I always grab a pencil and my banding wheel here, as well as a brush and a needle tool. So to get started, I like to center my pot on the banding wheel, since I am using it to divide up the space. And you can see here that my banding wheel is sectioned off into thirds. So I like to use the lines on the banding wheels as references. I'm going to grab my pencil and make marks on all 3 of those lines. Important thing to note is that the pencil you're using, I generally like to have a dull pencil, so you can kind of just like scribble it on a piece of paper for a minute just to kind of get that sharp tip off. I also use it at the angle you would for when you're like shading when you're drawing, so just not to carve through that underglaze layer, since we are working with a leather hard pot. And here I'm just splitting those thirds in half. So I'm creating 6 marks total on the pot. And this is just going to be a reference for me when I'm carving. I like to do this not to be exact, but just to kind of have references where to put my imagery. So I'm going to swap over here. I like to carve on an egg crate foam and grab my needle tool, and we'll get started on the carving. So this is the needle tool that I use. It's just a basic needle tool, and I've wrapped it in some hockey tape just to make it a little bit more ergonomic for my use, since I'm going to be carving for a while with it. And the reason why I use a needle tool over any other carving tool, an X-Acto knife or something purpose built for carving a pot, is I just really like the line quality that it gives me. It's a bit of a rougher line quality. It's something that I like the aesthetic of. I reference Mexican printmakers in my work. I really like the quality of the lines in intaglio prints and how it's carved with a scribe into metal. So there's a reference to that, as well as a lot of these drawings were kind of birthed from pen drawings that I've done in the past, and they're very scratchy, quick. So I wanted to kind of make an homage to that by using the needle tool, getting those rough lines, creating those burrs. And here I'm just starting by carving out the kind of the outline of the skull of the imagery. So I'm just getting everything laid out so I can have my spacing correct before I go back in and create the details that you're going to see in a moment here. I like to just use that same brush that I've used in the other sections of the video, and once I go all the way around the pot, I continue to knock those burrs off. So carve the whole pot, let those burrs dry up a little bit, and then you can knock them off with a nice soft brush so you're not pushing them back into the lines. So I'm going to get started here on the details of the carvings. And what I like to do is just start kind of wherever I'm at on the piece. So I don't have any like particular step-by-step process on how I carve my skulls. There's definitely spontaneity in my carvings, and I like the reference to my pen drawings in that spontaneity. So I slowly start to layer the details in the work. So you can see I'm adding, I'll put the eyes on, add the teeth, and then I'll start kind of outlining them with small marks. I'll start adding cracks in the skull, a little bit of shading here and there. And this is just layering the details in the actual image itself. So I will finish each skull individually. I don't add the parts one at a time. I just create all of the outlines of the skulls, and then I go in, add all the details, and kind of rinse and repeat throughout the rest of the pot. So I'm going to let this play here, and you can see the rest of the skulls get carved and kind of the variety in how I carve each skull. So once I've finished adding all of the details to each of the individual skulls, I'm going to start adding some guidelines for my carvings here. And this is specific to this motif itself, but it changes from piece to piece. I like to kind of have an idea of what I'm doing in my head and base it off of other works that I've done in the past, but I do like a level of spontaneity and minimal planning in my work as well. Just as a reference to the images that I was drawing with my pens, and kind of where this motif all started, as well as a reference to printmaking and kind of more of that sketchy style that I do like in intaglio. So what I'm doing here is I'm carving some vertebrae, kind of going from skull to skull, and I'm using those to split up the space on the pot. So I'm thinking about where glaze is going to be, where it's not going to be. So that bottom third there, I'm going to be adding some texture here in a moment. And I'm going to be leaving that unglazed to have a subtle texture on the hand, but also a kind of visual texture between the white and the red clay. That top section there, you can see there's that nice kind of smooth white backdrop that's going to help where the glaze is. It's going to help it pop. So I'm using this Mud Tools P24. It's a serrated rib. And I'm going to be using that to create that texture on that bottom third of my pot. So I'm going to be taking it and lightly scraping the surface, and what I'm looking for is like an even kind of 50-50 split between the white underglaze and then the clay coming through as well. I'm not looking to get rid of all of that white underglaze. I wanted to kind of reference the same lines that are happening in the eyes and the nose of the skull. So I use this to kind of create a visual noise as well as a subtle texture on the hand, like I was saying before. And the reason why I do this is I want to think about, it's important to think about your finished product from start to finish. So even when I'm on the wheel, I'm thinking about how I'm going to be addressing that surface in carving. And while I'm carving, I'm thinking about how I'm going to address that surface with glaze, with underglaze, all of that good stuff. So here I'm thinking about where glaze is going to go, which is going to be behind that behind the skulls on that white backdrop, as you can see here again, as well as on the inside of the pot and on the bottom of the pot as well, right there. And so I want this kind of ebb and flow of wet and dry, and you want to just think about creating visual depth in your pieces and layering those details to make that happen. Once my work has been bisqued, I use sandpaper as another tool to create depth in the surface of the work. So I'm going to be using this 220 grit wet dry sandpaper, and we're going to take it over to my tub of water. And the reason why I use a wet dry sandpaper is just to mitigate the dust in the air and make it a safer work environment for myself and anybody else in the studio. So I'm using a 220 grit, like I said, and the reason why I use that is because it is kind of this nice middle ground between a high and a low grit. So it does everything I want it to do. It makes the surface of the pot smooth to the touch, but it still removes enough material to pull that red clay through the white underglaze. And the reason why I'm doing that is, again, to create more depth, but also almost a pseudo-aged effect. So this is just a reference to the historical pre-Columbian pottery that I look at as a reference. And you can see that effect here, that red clay coming through, as well as I'm looking to kind of break the edges on the foot as well as the rim. And this just creates points of interest. I'm just going to rinse the pot off one more time, get all that debris off, which is really important to have a nice clean pot for the next steps. After I've sanded and cleaned up my pot, I'm going to start to apply the underglaze to the surface and kind of do an inlay wash hybrid. So I like to use just a jet black underglaze. I generally dilute it about 60-40 underglaze to water. I'm never too exact about it, but I do like to dilute it in order to make it go a little bit further and waste a little bit less underglaze. I'm going to be using this brush that I've been using throughout the video, and I just use it to wash the entire pot in the underglaze, as you can see here. And the reason why I do this is I like to make sure that all of those lines that I've drawn are inlaid, and they're going to be very emphasized once I remove the excess underglaze. But doing a full wash really helps kind of bring out the details in the pot as well, in the foot and in all of those little imperfections that happen on the surface. So I'm going to bring it over to my tub of water to help start wash off that underglaze. And you can see here all of those lines are nice and filled in. You really want to pay attention to that, making sure that your drawing is nice and inlaid before you go to wipe things off. So I'm going to wring out my sponge, still leaving a lot of water in there. It helps pull a lot of this underglaze off the surface. And the nice part about this is that you can kind of choose how much underglaze to leave depending on your own personal preference. I like to pull a lot of it off and just kind of let whatever sticks on the surface stay there. So I want that white backdrop to really make the glaze pop. This is just another level of adding detail and depth to your work. So leaving the underglaze in the little crevices as well as the drawings is just going to add to the level of depth that's happening in the work in the final product. And you can see here that all of the lines are inlaid. It's helping kind of pop the drawing out from the surface rather than having just that red clay. It's more of a black line drawing now, going back to referencing intaglio prints and pen drawings. So this part is really important to add that final layer of depth before we go into glazing. Now that I've finished all of the steps in creating the depth in my surface and kind of creating all those little details, I'm going to be setting up the work in order to be glazed. So I like to use just a wax resist. Right now I'm using a Bray wax. It's a little bit thicker than the other ones I've used in the past, and I really do enjoy that. It makes for less cleanup in the long run. Here you can see I'm using a different brush, and I use this brush for waxing because it's a bit smaller. For the smaller details, it's also a bit beat up just from using wax. And earlier I showed you there I have a bucket of soapy water. And the reason I do that is it just helps keep your brush a little bit cleaner when you're waxing. The wax doesn't stick to the brush as badly if you do have some soapy water alongside you. And if you ever feel like it's kind of clumping up in your brush, go ahead and give it a wash in that soapy water, and it should help clean everything out. So when I'm waxing, I really just try to take my time and really get right up to those lines. I'm not looking for perfection, but I want to get as close as I can to those lines that I've created for myself. The nice thing when you are waxing something that's been carved is those lines almost act like little barriers. They catch the extra wax, and you can use that to your advantage. And so when you're coming right up next to that line, if that line fills up with wax, that's right where you want to stop. And you kind of want to use that to help guide your brush as you're waxing the pot. And you can see here that I'm just taking the wax, I'm going over the skulls, the textured area on the bottom, and the vertebrae. And those are the sections that obviously aren't going to have glaze on them. And what I want is to just kind of use that 2/3, 1/3 ratio that we talked about earlier in the video to emphasize the texture and the depth that we've created in our surface so far. So another important thing about waxing is just being patient with it drying as well. So you really want to make sure that your wax is dry before you're touching it, and watch where your fingers are when you are waxing. I have my hand on the inside of the pot here, and I'm really trying my best not to touch the outside of the pot at all. If you do end up touching some of the wax while it's still wet and then end up touching an area you don't want wax on, it can potentially start resisting the glaze. And here I am just touching up the foot. I want glaze to be in that central area, but I don't want glaze to be all the way over the foot, obviously, so it's not sticking to the shelf, as you can see here. And use wax to highlight the dynamic surfaces that we've created throughout this video. So once my wax has dried, I'm going to move over to the glazing process. And generally, I just like to have a sponge little brush and my tongs. I'm going to get the glaze mixed up here. And I use the sponge just for kind of a general cleanup at the end. My brush is there just in case I miss a spot when I'm dipping my pot. That way I don't have to re-dip the pot and potentially make that layer of glaze a little bit too thick. You can see the tongs here that I use. They're just any kind of basic glazing tongs. The reason I like using these is I have a lot of wax surfaces on my pots, and I can kind of take advantage of that by placing them on the wax surface, at least on the outside. That way, just kind of mitigating the amount of pinholes that I'm going to have to clean up later. So when I'm dipping the pot, I want to rotate it around, make sure every surface is clean. You can see that the wax is helping that glaze roll right off. And I'm just really trying to shake all of that excess glaze off the surface here. So just paying attention to getting rid of that excess, making sure there's not too much dripping or pooling happening. So you can see here the glaze is all dried up. It's mostly clean, but there are some drips and there are some glaze beads on the wax. So we're going to take that over to the table and clean it up. I'm going to grab this little sponge here. It's just a little mud tool sponge, nothing too fancy. So you can see that there are those little glaze beads on the surface there. And I'm just going to really take my time with this part and make sure I'm cleaning everything up. We spent all that time creating these nice surfaces, and we want to make sure that there isn't glaze pooling where we don't want it to be. So just using any sponge, you can clean that all up and make sure that your wax surfaces are nice and glaze free. And just make sure that you're paying attention to every little detail. Even when you do a really good job waxing, glaze does like to stick in the little crevices. And you can see here that there's some bubbles from when I actually dipped the pot. And you can just take your finger and burnish those out. So you can use your finger and lightly kind of rub on the surface of your pot. This will help level everything out if you have little bubbles, little drips, or anything like that, or imperfections on your glazing surface. There's also this little scratch on the inside, and that came from the tongs that I was using. And you can do the same thing, just use your finger to kind of burnish that out. So you really just want to pay attention to the little details, making sure that the glaze is nice and prepared for the kiln. So here's one final look at the piece before we toss it in the kiln. I fire all of my work in an electric kiln, usually to cone 5 or cone 6. The reason why I use an electric kiln versus any other forms of firing is just for the predictability. Throughout this video, we've built up all of these different layers and creating depth in our surfaces, and so I want that to be predictable and to come through in the final product, as you can see right here. So you can see all of that sanding, inlaying, glazing, waxing, all of that stuff coming to fruition. Right here. I'm also going to be adding a few detail shots at the end of the video, just so you can see it in a better quality. So I like to use a red, white, and green colorway, just as a slight nod to the Mexican flag and adding another layer of culture into the work. So the last and most important step is going to be to test your work out. So I'm going to grab a little bit of my wife's homemade kombucha here, have a glass for myself. Thank you so much for watching. Salud.